Welcome to Legendary Talks, a My Spring Harvest podcast bringing you the best sermons, Bible studies and seminars from over the decades. Today we hear from Kate Middleton. She talks about sustaining light in dark times back at Spring Harvest 2024.
So good to be with you again for this last of our 3 sessions this year, looking at this big topic of mental health, mental and emotional well-being. Many of you will have been to one or both of the previous ones. If you didn't, my name is Kate Middleton. My background is that I was a medic, first of all, and then trained as a psychologist. But I've actually spent the last 20 years or so working for the church, leading in, first of all, Pentecostal, then Free Church context, and I am now ordained in the Anglican Church and living and serving in Brighton right now. I am also one of the directors of an organisation called the Mind and Soul Foundation. We are passionate about this topic of mental and emotional well-being. And as directors, there are 4 of us who lead that organisation. We have 2 psychiatrists, a vicar, and me as psychologist and vicar, whatever you call that. I always think it sounds like one of those jokes where 4 groups of people go into a pub and then something really funny happens, like 2 psychiatrists, a vicar, and a psychologist. Anyway, that's who we are. And we are passionate about this topic through its whole range, really. So from the end, obviously, thinking about clinical illness, psychiatric mental health problems, clinical diagnoses, and the really challenging issues that many people can face with those. But we're also interested at the other end of the spectrum, which is really what we're focusing on more in this series of seminars. And that's my particular passion too. So thinking about things like our emotions. What are emotions? What are they supposed to do? How do we manage them when they become so problematic? Thinking about emotional distress and how we deal with tough times and challenge. But also for me, particularly what I'm interested in is this big question of what it looks like in our current times to live as well, as psychologically well as we possibly can. So what does wellness look like? We talk so much in this field now about mental illness, but we don't talk enough about wellness. And this is the gift we really want to give to ourselves, but also to our family, to our friends, to those we love. And one of my big passions as well is the rising generations coming up behind us. I work a lot with youth and young adults. And I'm hearing lots of stories from them of anxiety, of hopelessness, big questions about this world that they are coming of age into, and also the impact that that will have on them. So the question is it possible for those young people to live their lives well, emotionally healthy, to maybe not just survive, but even thrive in spite of the challenges that their world is relentlessly bombarding them with? What does that look like? And so in these sessions, we've been talking about some of the big issues, some of the foundations that psychologically we build our lives on as human beings, that are so much a feature of what it is to be emotionally well, to be stable, to manage and be resilient in the face of life's challenges. And what we've been talking about is the contrast between some of the teaching that we get from our world, from our culture, the narratives and stories that we read and hear day in, day out, and the ancient wisdom of the Bible, and particularly how the latter really fits with what psychology and medicine and psychiatry and neuroscience and all these amazing perspectives on the human mind, with what they can also teach us about how to live in these current times, where our world might encourage us to build our lives on foundations that turn out to be flimsy, that can trigger a lot of anxiety and difficulty. The ancient wisdom of the Bible has something so crucial to teach us, to speak to not just us, but our whole culture in this season. And so as I share in these sessions, we've been talking about things that I hope will be helpful for each of us, but also that are crucial stories that we need to tell, things we need to speak into a culture and to generations who are desperately in need of hearing this message. So we hear this not just for ourselves and our own well-being, but for our responsibility and our calling to live as people of light and carry something better, speak something better into our world. And I know many of you will be carrying in your mind with you other people, groups of people, people you're concerned for, people you love. And so as we think about these topics and how they sit with us and our own experience, we also think about what it looks like to carry light into those spaces. And so today, as the final session, is really, really emphatically about that. And I want to talk to you about perhaps our biggest challenge as we sit and think about this field of mental health and wellness, this big topic. And I suppose, in effect, what I want to talk to you about is happiness. You know, I'm also a mum. Many of you will have heard me talk about my kids, tell many stories about my kids. My biggest wish for my kids is not that they, get the brilliant grades and the amazing degrees and the superb jobs, although, it would probably be good if my son did some work occasionally. I know it sounds harsh. Don't worry about him. He's living a great life, untroubled by school deadlines. Anyway. But my wish for my kids is that they might be happy, that they might enjoy life, that somehow they might get through all the rubbish that they see and hear and that they will no doubt experience as they grow, but that they might hold on to that increasingly elusive thing, happiness, that they might know how to find joy even in the midst of the most difficult circumstances. And these dreams that we hold for our children are starting to sound increasingly like crazy talk. You know, my daughter is 18 now, and she went to a party the other day. She does a lot of that. She's also living a great life. And she came back, and I was like, oh, how was it? Did you see all your old mates? She's like, yeah, it was fun. She's like, but Mum, I had a really weird moment. She's like, we were sitting there chatting, and I just had this sort of out-of-body experience where I sort of just, in my head, I like lifted beyond and looked around the room, and she's like, Mum, I'm the only person who's not got a mental health disorder. She's like, I'm the only person in that group now who's not on medication. And she's like, then they started discussing all their meds and comparing doses and things. She's like, it was so weird. She's like, that is so normal now for my generation. And this is the thing. Gosh, I'm so grateful to God that her journey so far hasn't led her into that place. But this is unusual now. We are talking about generations where actually mental ill health has become more the norm. There is an incredible culture around struggle. And there's lots of good things about that in terms of the support it offers, breaking down stigma, stereotypes, all of that stuff. But we need to talk more about what it looks like to overcome some of those issues. How can we teach people to find the elusive happiness even in the midst of trouble? And the troubled times that we're living in, they are a really important part of this conversation. We spoke yesterday about how we're living in a new era where the internet and social media and smartphones are transforming not just our culture, but literally our brains, keeping many psychologists excited and busy, charting the change in the way people think, the way their brains develop, the way they act and react to the world around them. And we need to recognize that alongside that, there is this mental health crisis. We are seeing soaring levels, not just of emotional distress, but clinical anxiety, depression, eating disorders, self-harm. It's a continuum from people who are just struggling and not enjoying life through to the much more serious issues that are requiring clinical intervention. And of course, the terrible tragedies that we hear. People losing their lives to suicide. People whose despair has taken them so far that they feel that's the only option for them. We need to speak into this. So once again today, I want to share with you some of that ancient biblical wisdom and help just journey through and understand how that sits with what we know about the mind. And think about, as people of God and people who just love our nearest and dearest and our friends and those we perhaps serve in our communities or people we lead in our churches, and say, what does that teach us about how we respond in this moment? Let's take a look at this passage from 1 Thessalonians 5. This is Paul writing, as he does, to the early church. And it's interesting, right at the start of this part of his letter, he is talking about seasons. He talks about times and dates. We all know that the world goes through different transitions, different seasons. He was writing in an ancient time now. I'm not a historian. My daughter and my husband are big historians. My level of history is basically now or the olden days. And then there is another one that I'm discovering, which is bonkers old, which I really didn't know anything about till recently. But anyway, he is writing in the olden days, possibly bonkers old, somewhere in that category. Sorry to the historians in the room. But we are now way beyond that. We are in this really interesting season. One that I think will be critical for the human race, a really significant moment. And what does Paul say about these times and seasons? He says in verse 2 that God will come when? In the night. The Bible talks a lot about darkness. It's a metaphor for difficult and challenging times, also maybe for spiritual warfare. And boy, are we experiencing darkness in probably both of those senses. And we'll talk about both of those today. But Paul goes on to say something really interesting if you look at verse 4. What he says is we, as people of God, we're including ourselves in that group that he was addressing, we are not in darkness. Now, what does that mean? I mean, it's all very helpful if you're experiencing really dark and difficult times and someone says, but you are a child of God, you are not in darkness. And you're like, great, that's really helpful. I mean, we do experience the same tough times as everyone else does. If you dial back a bit to verse 3, because verse 4 starts with a but, so always look at what's the but, what's he said before that. He's talking about while other people might be reassuring and saying everything's okay, something bad will happen and surprise people. Literally the word he uses talks about doom, it's cheery, sort of darkness, despair, difficulty will come suddenly upon people, even though there have been these reassurances. And the implication is it will take them by surprise. It will be sudden and shocking. And so verse 4 then sits better in that context. There's something about us as people of God that this should not surprise us, this level of despair, of difficulty, of darkness. Now, the language, again, is interesting. I shared in the first session, my family spent 2 years living in France. My husband is a very good French speaker. He worked in French. My daughter, having spent 2 years in French school, is now bilingual. I speak really bad French, but well enough to get by. And what I discovered then is how when you're speaking in a language that isn't your own, when you're translating your thoughts into another language, you often just lose the nuances, the subtlety of what you're trying to say. So I always like to look at the original language that these texts were written in. And this word that's translated in this translation as surprise literally actually has a much wider meaning. It describes the possibility of something overwhelming us, of ambushing us, of overpowering us. So what Paul is saying is that something about the things that we hold as people of God means that although difficult times will come, although we still experience darkness and doom and despair, it will not or it need not overwhelm us. It need not overpower us. Paul carries on in verse 5, you are children of light and of the day. You do not belong to the darkness. This is so, so important. Our nature as children of God is that we live and breathe and work and interact and love and learn and all those things in the world, but we have another perspective. We have a heavenly perspective, a different understanding that sits alongside that. We experience the darkness and difficulty, but what Paul is saying here is important. It's about our identity. It's about the impact that has on us. We experience it, but it doesn't get to define us. It doesn't get to destroy us or own us or overcome us. There is a way to live in these dark times without those things happening. This is about our reaction to dark times, therefore. There's an ancient text, Micah 7:8, says, "Though I sit in darkness, the Lord will be my light." There is a way, the Bible is telling us, for us to experience darkness, but for it not to overwhelm us, for it not to own us. And that, in this season, is probably the most important thing I could teach someone. How do you do that? How do you flourish in spite of difficulty? How do you hold happiness when it feels like the world is in complete chaos and you see corruption and darkness all around you? I call this talk night vision, and some people in the room, I'm revealing my age, some people might recognize an old Suzanne Vega song, very old, although everything that's old is now completely back in. So my daughter's listening to the same stuff I listened to when I was her age, which is very strange. But there's this old Suzanne Vega song, it's called Night Vision, and she says this line, and it just, to me, it catches everything about my heart. She's talking about, I think, her children. She says, and her desire, she says, "I would shelter you and keep you in light, but I can only teach you night vision." That's how I feel, not just for my kids, but every time I talk to an audience like this, every conversation I have around mental health, every church I visit, my own church as well. I wish with all my heart, my prayer, I would love to be able to teach you skills that would keep you in light. I wish I could save people from the difficulties of life. And some of those are the big, awful things. Thankfully, the more unusual things, the trauma, the tragedy, the abuse. But a lot of the things that people find just soul-destroying are just the rubbish things of everyday life. You know, financial pressure, disappointment, relationship challenges, illness and ill health that is so crippling to people and so steals so much of life from them. I wish I could find a way to take those things from people, but I can't. The reality is we do live in times where there is a lot of darkness and difficulty around. I can only teach you night vision. What does it look like to live as children of light in times when we do feel sometimes surrounded by darkness? Paul carries on in that Thessalonians passage, verse 6. So, he says, right, so this is action stations. What's the so? He says two things we need to be. The common translation puts it like this: we need to be awake and sober. Literally, his language basically means we need to have our wits about us. We cannot just go along with stuff automatically. We have to be mindful. We have to be wise. We have to be aware and watchful. We have to take the time to intentionally reflect. What are the stories that we need to retell? What are the messages that we need to give? What are the things that we need to teach, but also for us that we need to build our life on? Our culture will tell us many things, but they are not all things that lead to health. They might feel in the moment really good, but we have to be wise and think, what's the end of this journey? Is this releasing people or is it restricting them? Is it enabling them or is it disabling? And these are not easy conversations to have. We have them in our culture. We are increasingly needing to have them in our church as well. But we need to be wise. We need to be informed. The Bible does promise us that there is a way we can walk into darkness. Psalm 23 promises us we can walk into the deepest darkness, but fear no evil, because God is with us, because we are children of light. I went on a walk the other day with my son. One of the many things that we did in pandemic, just to try and create spaces where he could chat and reflect and process everything that was going on, was a mum's walking club, which somehow led to us getting a dog. I really don't know how that happened, and it wasn't my wisest decision. We love him very much, but complete chaos if anyone's considering getting a dog. He's 2 now, and apparently that means he's going to transform into a calm and sensible adult dog, but I am yet to see that. Anyway, we were walking walking with Wilbur the dog, and it was really dark, and we took one of my son's favourite routes, but there's no streetlights there, pitch black, and suddenly, the dog, because he's a bit mad, he smelled something, so he's turned into Scrappy-Doo, any Scooby-Doo fans, he's like, let me at him, and we're like, what has he smelled? There's rustling in the bushes. It was a little bit scary, and my son is slightly on the edge of freaking out, but then I remembered, of course, I've got my phone, and it has a torch on it. You turn a light on in the darkness and suddenly it doesn't feel so scary. We can walk into deepest darkness because we carry light with us. So how do we do this then? It's all very well talking about it. It's a nice, warm, fuzzy message. But what does it actually look like practically to do that, to carry light in darkness, to intentionally change our focus, to be mindful, to be wise? I've spent most of my life hoping that I will become wise as I get older. I just feel like I realize more and more how much I get wrong. I don't know if anybody else has discovered that as they've aged. But let's have a think about that. And first of all, I think we need to talk a bit more on something that we mentioned briefly yesterday, and that is overwhelm. The psalmist also teaches us that we are created intentionally and beautifully by God, God who makes our inmost being, who designed the human body and brain. That includes our emotional selves. So often the message that we get about wellness is about eradicating negative emotions. We can easily think, if I'm going to live life emotionally well, I shouldn't be experiencing any anxiety or any sadness. We can medicalize some of those things, but actually they are part of normal, healthy responses, particularly in difficult circumstances or when something really matters to you. They're part of the way that your brain was designed to work. So what are they supposed to do? One of my earliest interests in terms of research was looking at emotions and the function that they have in our minds. And it's a hugely complex area that draws in insights from all sorts of different fields. But just think for a moment, in your own mind, of the last time you experienced an emotion. You might want to pick one of the easier ones to reflect on, something like anxiety or sadness. They're more obvious in our experience of them. But just think, what was it about the way you were feeling in that moment that makes you so sure it was that emotion? Lots of studies that reflect on this question. And the combination of things we experience teaches us about three really important functions of emotions, particularly the tricky ones, in the way our mind was designed to work. So the first thing a lot of people talk about, let's say you're thinking about anxiety as well, I felt really uncomfortable. Maybe you've got like butterflies in your stomach, or you just feel sort of fidgety, or just that sort of sense of dis-ease, something you just can't really settle. There's something that gets your attention. And emotions are really like the smoke alarm of your mind. Their job is to grab your attention. There's a lot going on in life, in the world around you. Your brain needs a way to make sure you don't miss something that could be really significant. And emotions are designed to do that. They're a whole body experience, but one of the things that we notice is that they grab our attention. I remember once when I had a hire car when we'd come back when we were living in France, and you've got to refuel it before you take it to the airport, and I'm literally about to put the fuel in, and suddenly I felt really anxious, really uncomfortable, and I'm literally like, why am I suddenly feeling this? And then I realized I'm about to put the wrong fuel in the car. And don't worry, I didn't. It's fine. But I'm so grateful for my brain, because it's somehow got, my mind was on am I going to catch my flight, and are my timings okay, and did I leave anything in the hotel? But my brain is like, wah, wah, you need to pay more attention to this woman. So it's like a smoke alarm. It grabs your attention. The second thing that whole body change does is it gets you ready to act or react. Like the sprinter on the starting blocks, just in case you need to respond. Maybe you're going to need to fight something off. Maybe you're going to need to flee, to run, to get out of a situation. The change in your body is about, making sure that you've got the fuel and the requirements to do that. And then the third thing that an emotional response does is it gets you thinking. It gets you analysing, like, what is going on in this moment that has triggered this emotion? Just like me stood at the petrol station, like, what is it? Why have I had this reaction? And then, in an ideal sort of lab circumstance, an emotion would die out because it's kind of done its job. You've done the analysis, you've decided whether you need to act or do anything, and so the emotion should just die away. Of course, life is a lot more complicated than a laboratory circumstance, and emotions rarely act in that clean a way. But note from this, emotions are not illness. They can cause us to become unwell. They can overwhelm us. They can become challenging. They can push us into actions and reactions that become illness. But the root emotion is not in itself always the problem. It's about what happens next. We need to become less fearful of our natural emotional reactions and instead become more analytical. Where is this coming from? What is it designed to do? What is it telling us? Of course, your brain has another route. What I've just described, that's all quite involved. It takes time. It requires reflection. What if you're in an emergency scenario? What if you've just stepped out into the road and there's a bus coming, or you're walking back to your chalet tonight and a bear jumps out from behind a car at you, which probably won't happen, but, you know, it's Minehead. It's the country. It's more likely to be one of those cute little ponies, as far as I understand. But anyway, so your brain has this emergency mode. We talked about this yesterday. And what that is a quick, impulsive action route. So it does two key things. First of all, it overrides your ability to think and analyse. It drops your ability to do that like a stone. It switches off your analytical mind. And then you get this powerful emotional surge. People describe it as like a fog, something that feels overwhelming, often the D word, dread. That weird emotional sense, and it carries with it a really important impulsive need to do something. The question is what? And of course, in the worst scenarios, your ability to think things through is just rubbish. So you know you need to do something, but you can't think of anything. You feel trapped, you feel overwhelmed. Your only options are the basic ones: run, fight, those sorts of things. This is what Paul is talking about, I believe, when he talks about being seized by darkness and doom and despair. It's the difference between experiencing it and being overwhelmed by it. When it overpowers your mind, when you feel powerless against it, when you don't know what to do. Young people in particular will talk to me often about their emotions just feeling relentless, out of their control. One young person once said to me, it's like being on a boat in the ocean and you just get hit by waves and you've got no oars, no sail. There's nothing you can do but just sit there and take it. This experience of emotions that's so overwhelming, so painful, so difficult. Probably the most challenging human emotional experience is what we call despair. Clinicians recognize this unique and overwhelming combination of the emotional experience, the thoughts that go with it, just this sense of utter hopelessness, combined with that weird sort of sense of dread, the need to do something, somehow change it, somehow get out of a situation that feels impossible to solve. It's a horrendous experience. This is what it's like to feel seized by darkness. Despair, I believe, is also a huge spiritual issue. So many young people now, and adults as well, but hitting context combinations of circumstances that lead them just feeling utterly hopeless, overwhelmed by darkness. When we remove all light and hope, despair is the result. The risk of our conversations about mental health right now is that if we don't talk more about hope, we will grow this sense of despair. Young people who, like so many who talk to me, just feel like they're doomed. Literally, as Paul says, doom is coming upon them. Life is tough and they will probably struggle. There is not much hope. So tragic to read in the press stories in other countries of people struggling with mental ill health and emotional distress, choosing to end their life, choosing to a suicide, whether it's assisted or, even in this country, tragically under their own hand. We've got to a place where we're almost prescribing death as the only solution now to despair. That's not right. People, we need to hold light. We are people of God. We are children of light. We need to speak something better into this story. We can't solve all the darkness, but we can speak light. We can teach people how to manage the challenges of everyday life that unfortunately are real right now.
Hello, it's Abby Guinness here. I hope you're enjoying this episode of Legendary Talks. If you're looking for more inspirational and insightful content like this, may I direct your attention to My Spring Harvest Plus. It's our streaming website with hundreds of great talks from Spring Harvest events, present and past. It's only £5.50 a month to subscribe for all kinds of excellent content. Tap or click the link in the description or caption to discover more about My Spring Harvest Plus.
Even as people of God, we experience this. It is a live experience of a life of ministry, a life walking with the Lord. Paul, in another of his letters, 1 Timothy 6, describes that experience using a sort of battle terminology. He says we should fight the good fight of faith. I love the language that he uses here. He uses a Greek word, agon. You might recognize that it's the sort of start of the source of our word to agonize. It's actually a Greek word that referred to a type of physical contests. They loved their contests and, of course, the precursors to the Olympics, where people's physical ability was challenged and pushed to the absolute limit. We still love that now. We love to see superhuman people beating the records, achieving amazing things. But what was great about these ancient contests was that what made them really exciting was the people who won weren't always the people who were physically most able. There was something else that went into that story. The people who won were the people who, yes, had the physical ability, but they could also respond well to the mental pressure, because the contests were deliberately designed to push people to the limit, not just physically, but psychologically. And this is the word that comes to mind when Paul is teaching about his experience of what life is like walking with the Lord. It's not a great sales pitch, is it? We quite often will evangelize to people and tell a story that sort of makes it sound like you give your life to the Lord and all your problems are gone. But we cannot take people out of darkness. That's not true. And life in ministry, life with the Lord, life holding our responsibility to carry light is not always easy. There are many, many things to recommend it with. But we need to be honest, it's challenging. And part of that comes, I believe, because of the spiritual battle. There is something about our life of faith that challenges your mind in particular. I don't believe that comes from God. I believe that our position of people in light in this dark world is a contested one. This is a spiritual battle. Did you know the battle for your mind is a real one? Especially those of you who are in leadership. But by leadership, I also include parenthood, volunteering, all the many different forms that can take. The battle for your mind is real. If I wanted to take you out of that position, yes, I could do it physically, but much more easy if I take you out through your mind, through you working yourself into exhaustion and burning out, or through those anxieties that keep you awake at night, or through just picking away at your confidence enough that you don't take the opportunity or step into the space that God is calling you to. You are much more likely, statistically, to be limited in life, limited in your flourishing, limited in releasing your potential, both in secular terms, but also spiritual terms. You're much more likely to be limited by things like your ability to manage pressure, your ability to respond well to emotions like anxiety, sadness, your ability to do things like deal with disappointment. Much more likely to be limited by those things than by your academic ability or your qualifications. When I go and teach young people in schools, particularly the high-achieving, brilliant ones, I'm so aware of this. The most important thing I can teach them is nothing about maths or science or history, which is a good thing because you've heard the level my history is. What I need to teach them is how to deal with the challenges of growing up in dark times. So how do we do it then? I want to share with you 3 important steps for developing night vision, 3 things that we can pass on, as well as 3 things that I pray will help us. And the first one is this: we need to call out overwhelm. We need to speak honestly about what it feels like. We need to teach ourselves and those we care about to recognize overwhelm, to recognize when our minds have been pushed into this space. A huge percentage of the mental health stuff that I get asked, particularly in acute, in the moment challenges, is people who have been pushed into overwhelm. Life is complicated. And remember, stress isn't just distress. You might be having a great time right now. You might be in the best moment of your life. Maybe you've just got married, you've just had your first baby, you're in the job you always dreamed of. But that's a lot. And anything that places demand on your brain, if you think of your sort of capacity, like a sort of 0 to 10 scale or the water level in a pool, we all have a limit. And when the water's up to your neck, or if you're more of a 0 to 10 scale sort of person, usually about 7 or 8, we start to get into this emergency zone space. And we start to experience suddenly these pangs of anxiety. Sometimes people will come to me and say, I just don't know what happened. One day I just had a panic attack out of the blue. I'd never had one before. Probably life has pushed you into that zone and you didn't even realize it. We start to struggle with just feeling like we're not the best versions of ourselves. We're not problem solving as well. We're not thinking as clearly because we're in that zone. We need to recognize overwhelm. The most important thing when you're in that space, if you remember only one thing from today, and if you share only one thing from today, it is this: when you're in overwhelm, things are almost definitely not as bad as they feel. It feels like complete catastrophe. It feels completely hopeless. You can't think of a thing that you could possibly do to solve this problem that you're up against. But so much of that is because you are overwhelmed. We make this mistake with emotions sometimes because we assume that they're telling us the truth. What's the job of your smoke alarm? Does it tell you there is definitely a fire and you are going to die? No. I used to ask at sessions like this, I used to say, the last time your smoke alarm went off, was your house burning down? Until at one seminar a bit like this, somebody's put their hand up and was like, yeah. And I'm like, oh, that's awkward. But that's really rare. Your smoke alarm actually is about making sure that doesn't happen. It's designed to prevent. It's not telling you the worst is going to happen. It's supposed to help you take actions to prevent that. Anxiety is an emotion. Gosh, people these days, I have anxiety. It's such a common thing to struggle with. It's the most common emotion that I'm asked to speak on. But anxiety is crucial. It stops you, accidentally dying. My son could do with a lot more anxiety when he's crossing the road, believe me. So anxiety in itself is not bad. The difficulty comes when it's overwhelming, when there's too much of it, when your circumstances mean that you're dealing with a barrage of it, when your response to it and your fear of it means that it magnifies what you're experiencing instead of helping you to feel under control and manage what you're experiencing. These are very subtle differences, but they make all the difference. So next time you feel like, absolute disaster zone. My daughter has heard too many of my talks. Both my kids think it's absolutely hilarious that I do this, as I'm sure you can imagine. My son plays them sometimes to me and says, Mom, these people think you're an expert. He thinks it's hilarious. But my daughter will sometimes text me in life's crisis moments. I think I shared yesterday that parenting a young adult is officially my least favorite phase so far of parenting. It's like all the responsibility and no control, and you only hear about the worst moments of their life quite often, occasionally the best. But she will sometimes text me, I will just get this text in capitals. It says, Mum, I'm not thriving. Like, do something about it. And my first question to her in those moments is, what number? Where are you on that scale? I know, it's really irritating. I actually got told off whilst I was here for being irritatingly and incessantly positive. Just so you know, that's what it's like living with me. But so what number? Because if you think on that 0 to 10 scale, where are you? And I don't just mean emotionally, I mean in all the messy madness of life. You know, I am at that zone where I have a still young enough child that I have to keep quite a close eye on him. I've got this young adult. I also have elderly parents and a job with lots of responsibility. There are some days when my entire life feels like one of those logic problems where, you know, you've got like the fox and the chicken and the bag of grain and you've got to get them all across the river and you sort of know there is a solution, but you haven't really found it yet. Are you in overwhelm? Because if you are, the first thing you need to do is get out of that headspace. Do something that will drop your overwhelm level and see how much difference it makes. How do you do that? Simple tips. Go to the Mind and Soul Foundation website if you want to find more on this. But there are many things you can do. There are breathing exercises. I'm a big fan of something called 4-7-8 breathing. We don't have time to go through that now, but you can find information on it on the Mind and Soul website, or you can just Google it. It's a breathing technique that drops your physiological stress level quite quickly. It's simple, something you can practice. If that's not so much your thing, try humming. Some people find focusing on their breathing immediately makes them anxious because you kind of overthink it. If that's you, find a favourite tune, all the better if it's a worship song or something that just lifts your focus back to the Lord, and hum it. You can't hum or sing. I mean, you can sing, but if you're in the open plan office at work, that might not go down so well. But humming and singing, you can't do that without breathing well. So it's a good way of just dropping your physiological stress level. If nothing else, get yourself somewhere you can see the sky. We'll talk about why that's helpful. Just get out of the situation for a minute. Watch the clouds go by. Stand under a tree. Just grab a breath. Nip to the loo. If nothing else, in the craziest moments, although this doesn't really apply to parenting, because mine are quite old, and I still find that quite often if I've nipped to the loo, either one of my children or the flipping dog, they follow me there now, and there's like scratching on the door. But anyway, nip to the loo. Usually people can't follow you there. Grab a moment. How much does it change if you just drop out of overwhelm? That's number one. The second thing, therefore, is watch your rhythms. One of the interesting challenges of life is that 0 to 10 scale physiologically, that it's the same, it sort of controls your ability to act and react and respond to life in general, but it's also the one your emotions operate on. What that means is if your stress level is high because life is busy, remembering that could be good busy, not always bad busy, your baseline might already be at 7, so it only takes something small to push you into overwhelm. You know, sometimes one of my kids will come home and I'll just sort of say to them like, oh, how was your day? And they lose it. And I'm like, what did I say? And it's just they were already in that space. Physiological things can also raise your level. You know, you've heard the are you hangry thing, you know, when your blood sugar is low. Gosh, my son, quite often it's like, just give him some food and then step away. If you're tired, if you're exhausted, later at 4 o'clock with some of my amazing colleagues, I'll be talking about menopause. Ladies, a whole conversation. If you are hormonal, my husband and I have lots of discussions about my rage these days. I'm releasing, it's very cathartic for me, like my inner rage, I don't think he enjoys it as much. But so just think, where is your baseline? What are you doing, not just in the moment, but more generally in your rhythms of life to try and work to keep yourself further down that scale? There's an American church leader, a guy called Carey Nieuwhof, and he wrote a book on this. And he talks about what he calls low-level burnout. You know, he says it's where the functions of life continue, but the joy of life is gone. One of the problems I find, particularly with church people, because they're so passionate and so driven and so want to change the world, is that they will just push themselves so high. They're right on the edge all the time. And the game we kind of play with ourselves is, in all of those moments, we ask ourselves this question. We say, have I collapsed yet? And if the answer is no, then great, let's carry on. Some of us need to pause. You know, if you are always thinking, oh, the next season will be quieter, it never is, let me tell you that. The next season will be calmer. The next season, my stress levels will be better. I'll get my blood pressure checked again in a couple of months. Those times often never come. Be careful if you are living life in low-level burnout. What do you do that regularly drops your overall stress level? Think about the things you do to de-stress. If you want to read more about this, there's a book that's in the bookshop I wrote called Refuel. And it takes you through a process of quite analytically practicing things to find out how to relax. Did you know you need to learn how to relax? And life these days often teaches us exactly the opposite. It teaches us how to be wired, constantly on, constantly stimulated. It's great if you are loving that sort of thing and if your life is in balance, but if you're already exhausted, sometimes you just need to learn what do you do? It's one of the reasons I bike so much. If you follow me on social media, you will find lots of pictures of me out on my bike. This is not some kind of training regime or anything like that, as I spoke about yesterday. It's headspace. And I know it's good for my soul. It's good physiologically because the exercise is good at literally physiologically dropping those stress hormones. But it's quiet and it helps me reflect. You know, people are always trying to come with me on bike rides. My husband's like, oh, I've got a great idea. Let's go out together. And I'm like, mate, you have not figured out what this is about. I don't want you there. My kids get it sometimes if I'm a bit cranky. They have been known to be like, Mum, why don't you go out on your bike for quite a long time? So what do you do? My main message on this is practicing calm what needs to be automatic in chaos. We need to build the patterns, build the rhythms, build the foundation so that if the world goes mad, they're already there. So when lockdown hit and pandemic, which for me was one of the busiest and most professionally challenging moments of my career and life so far, I already had this habit of riding. Believe me, I did it every single day. And it was brilliant because there was no cars on the road. But so practicing calm, what needs to be your instinct in chaos. Otherwise, when chaos hits and your mind isn't working and you're overwhelmed, you won't know what to do. It needs to be automatic. It needs to be instinct. So think about your rhythms. And then number 3, perhaps which should have been number 1, is don't forget God. You know, our culture talks so much about well-being these days and all the things you need to do. I used to talk a lot trying to be clever and use words about how do we live well in this season. And then someone said to me, you know, but when you say well, it makes it sound like it's a value judgment. Like, should I feel guilty that I'm not doing this well, therefore, that I'm ill, that I'm struggling? And I was like, gosh, I'd never thought of that. But it is true. We hear this barrage of stuff we're supposed to do. Like, how on earth does anyone fit that stuff in? It's like, gosh, just the dietary advice is exhausting. The amount of protein I'm supposed to eat. I mean, I could just spend my entire life doing that and I'd have no time to do anything else. Then I'm supposed to exercise. I'm supposed to have valued time with my kids. I'm supposed to achieve at my job. It's just, I literally can't do all of it. I can't fit it all in. Don't forget, there's a bigger story, a more important perspective than what our culture shares, and that is our heavenly perspective. You know, we started off today asking some big questions about happiness. I want to share with you some statistics about the average happiness experience. I want to say to many of us, don't panic. If we flick the graph up on the stage, this is your sort of average happiness level. Notice in the middle, age 50, which I would like to say I am not at yet, but quite close to. So life happiness does tend to follow this little dip curve. And there's this wonderful moment in midlife that I have talked about where you're actually under quite a lot of pressure. Life becomes quite complicated. Doing things for yourself is remarkably difficult because you seem to be responsible for literally everyone else and everything else. Like, no one else in my household changes toilet rolls. What is that about? Why is this my job? Anyway, so some of you are like, well, I actually do change the toilet rolls. Well, good for you. Come and live with me. But there is this pattern in life. There's a comment from a guy called Dan Kopf. He's a journalist from the World Economic Forum. He puts it like this: life starts well and ends well. The middle often stinks. Extra prayer ministry for you if you're in that zone. But actually, there are all sorts of things that can cause challenge. You know, my daughter looks at that graph and she takes real issue with it. She does not agree. She thinks it's a nightmare being her age. It's all our fault. We've destroyed the world and the government are corrupt and the church isn't much better, etc., etc. So anyway, what if you're in, whatever your age or cause, you're in that zone? Or actually, Life is hard. Maybe you're in that low-level burnout. Well, can you be happy? You know, the Bible teaches us that there is a source of something positive, something that can sustain us in tough times. It talks about joy. Psychologists talk about joy too, and they recognize that it's different to happiness. Joy is defined as a positive emotional state, not dependent on external events, but coming from within an individual. I want to suggest to you that joy, in its best sense, comes from outside of the individual, because it's something that is a gift to us from God. Nehemiah tells us this about joy. It says the joy of the Lord is our strength. Literally an ancient Hebrew word that means it's our fortress, it's our tower, our castle. You know, I was biking out by Dunster yesterday. You can see like the castle up on the hill. It's exactly what Nehemiah is talking about. It's the safe place you can retreat to in tough times or stormy times. It's where your heart goes instinctively when darkness falls or storms blow up. Looking into the New Testament, Acts 2:28 talks about this and the challenges of this path through life. Like, how do we do life? You have made known to me the path of life. You will fill me with joy in your presence. The joy of the Lord should be an instinctive practice part of our toolkit to manage life. But again, it's something we have to learn. Interestingly, Peter, and this is Peter talking. We talked a lot about Peter yesterday. He's quoting an old Davidic psalm, Psalm 16. And he, when he quotes it, it's written in Greek. He's using this Greek word that, again, comes from sport. They love their sport. And it's the word for what you feel when your team have won. Football is, you know, a powerfully fought over thing in my household. My husband is a long-term Norwich fan. Apparently that's quite disappointing. I don't really follow football. My son is a Swansea fan because we're Welsh, so that's where his heart is. We now live in Brighton. Anyway, sometimes it goes better than others emotionally. But when your team has won, it's that sense. That's what Peter is talking about. It's about your perspective lifting to a bigger victory. It's about what sustains us, a hope that is beyond the darkness that we're currently in. Recognizing that although we live in a tension right now where it feels like the world is dark, the end of the story is good. My son's not sure what he thinks about God at the moment, but he will often come to me and says, "Mummy, are you still sure that God will redeem the world?" I'm like, "Mate, I'm still sure." And then he just goes away again. This is the hope that sustains us at the end of the day when things feel overwhelming and difficult. When we worship, we intentionally lift our eyes from the world to the Lord. I love the A.W. Tozer quote. He says, when we are looking at God, we do not see ourselves, and he calls it blessed riddance. Sometimes what we need most in those overwhelmed moments is just to lift our minds for a moment from the everyday and the challenge and the difficulty. Worship is a wonderful way to do that. Another thing that's worth thinking about is what psychologists call awe, A-W-E, not the rowing kind. Awe is, again, something that this whole field of positive psychology really has just grown up in the last decade or so, and it's something heavily researched because awe, it describes something we experience as human beings, and what we know about it is that it is remarkably good for you. It drops your physiological stress level, drops your emotional distress level, but also the physical markers of that, so blood pressure, all the negative physical impact of it. It makes you feel better. I love, this is Jonathan Haidt, who I've quoted quite a lot this time and now has really risen to prominence as well. He says that awe acts like a kind of reset button. It makes people forget themselves and their petty concerns. The secular literature would say that awe is triggered by something that reminds you of a bigger picture. You're part of something bigger. It's because it reminds you of God. I'm convinced by this. It lifts your mind to a bigger perspective. We know that we can trigger awe in various ways. We can connect with nature, for example. So all those beautiful views, the sunset, looking at the night sky. One of the most reliable descriptions of awe is what astronauts experience when they look back on the Earth from space. It's this remarkably powerful, usually life-changing change of perspective. I believe that it's because it's reminding us about God. We can also experience awe through, as the psychologists would teach, being part of something bigger. Join a choir, do something as part of a team, be part of a community action that feels like it's really had a good impact. That also can trigger awe. But the best things we can do, I believe, are things that remind us of God. You know, a worship moment, walking into a beautiful cathedral. I'm discovering that there's quite a resurgence of just a love of the beauty of liturgy and those sort of more formal practices of church now, particularly among young people, many of whom are questioning quite cynically the sort of more stage-based worship experiences that I've grown up with. And I think part of that is this experience of awe, just the stillness, the quiet, but a very unforced awe, recognizing that God is there, God is bigger, God is solid, God is reliable, the repetition and the rhythm of those traditions, the beautiful words, there's something there. One of the things about how we experience God when our emotions are high, when we're in overwhelm, is often the thing that used to really do it for you doesn't in those moments. So you might need to explore some new things. If you are usually, you know, the person on the front row in the big tent, loving the noise and the band and everything, but you just feel like you can't take it, think about something else. You know, some days I love that stuff. Some days I just need to get on my bike and go and sit and be with nature and no other people, no one but me and God and the beauty of what surrounds me. Practice, if you've never done it, some of those ancient prayer rhythms, you know, hook yourself up with the Lectio Divina app or the Church of England prayer app that takes you through the rhythm of morning prayer, evening prayer. I always thought I'd find it incredibly boring. It turns out it's not. It's amazing because it's a rhythm and a practice that keeps you grounded. There's something amazing in some of these practices. And whatever you do, whatever you explore, whatever you find that works for you, this is about connecting you to the ultimate hope, refilling again and again your ability to hold hope and light and take it out to other people who don't have that personal relationship but desperately need to hear it. I want to just end by sharing with you another one of Paul's great pieces of psychological wisdom, and it's an oft quoted verse from Philippians 4. You'll have heard it before. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your request to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. It's a beautiful piece of writing, and it's a beautiful blessing that you'll probably have heard many times spoken over congregations and groups and individuals. Again, the language is really important, though. Have you ever had this quoted in a moment when you're actually freaking out, anxious about something really bad that may well happen, has happened, is probably going to happen? And then some really helpful person says to you, no, do not be anxious about anything. And you just think, this is not blessing me right now. The word Paul uses is a beautiful one. There are many different words for anxiety in the Greek language. This one is literally a word that describes what happens when there are so many draws on your attention, so many things that you should be worrying about, so many things that could be significant, so many things psychologically that are triggering anxiety in your mind, that you feel literally pulled apart. You don't even know which to deal with next. You're completely overwhelmed what's happening. That's what the word describes. What Paul is saying here is don't be pulled apart. Don't be in pieces. Find peace. And here's the way to do it. In a moment when your mind is overwhelmed and you can't think clearly and you're in the emergency zone, you need something beyond your own mind. You need a peace that comes from beyond yourself. Peace and refueling and re-hoping that is a gift from God, because we cannot do this purely under our own strength, because we do live in dark times, but we do not belong to the darkness, because we are called to be children of light and carry light. But we can't always produce that ourselves. We need to reach out to something bigger, something better, something beyond ourselves. So why don't we just pause, as we've done each session, before we move on back to the busyness of the day, and just take an opportunity to rest with the Lord. What's he been saying to you today and in these last few sessions? Are you painfully aware that you're in that emergency zone? Are you thinking, gosh, I don't know how to change the level of complexity in my life right now? Are you very aware of darkness and difficulty for you or other people, your need to somehow speak something that brings light or hope? Do you feel pulled in many different directions? Does the Lord want to say to you, don't be pulled apart by the challenges of this world. Don't be overwhelmed by the darkness. Instead, give things to me and let me give to you a peace that comes from beyond your mind. Our world teaches us the answer is in your mind. There's some good stuff that we can practice ourselves, but at the end of the day, we need something better than us. So, Lord God, in this moment, we recognize our humanity. We recognize our limitation, our challenge. We recognize that we often don't have the answers. We face disappointments because things are disappointing. We face darkness because things are dark. We face despair because sometimes things do feel hopeless. Lord, we are so grateful that our own cleverness and creativity is not all we have to depend upon. And Father, in this moment, we want to hand things to you. Maybe there's things you want to just name before the Lord right now that you want to leave with him. And we say, Lord God, we need you. We cannot do this on our own. Help us be children of light. Help us carry light for ourselves. But more than that, help us to carry light for the people we love the most, the people we lead, the people we connect with in our communities, as part of our great calling to bring something of the kingdom of heaven here on earth, to shine light into darkness, to bring hope where there is despair, to bring peace where there is panic. Lord God, fill us with your light that we can be light carriers. And I do pray now as we're at the end of this little series for the peace of God. Lord, may you bless us. May you fill us with your light and hope. May you fill us with a source of hope that holds even against the barrage of hopelessness or challenge. May you protect us from all evil. May you enable us to support and lead and guide the people who are most precious to us. And may the peace of God that surpasses all understanding guide and guard and protect our hearts and minds, that we may enable it to do the same for the people we love and care for. We leave all these things in your hand, Lord God.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Legendary Talks. If you enjoyed it, make sure you hit subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and visit springharvest.org to find out more.